The fog rolled in thick over the dark streets of Harlem, a quiet blanket that masked the tension simmering beneath the surface. It was late, the kind of late that made every shadow feel menacing, every footstep echoing louder than it should. In the dim light of a flickering street lamp, Bumpy Johnson stood, his sharp eyes scanning the alleyways, his mind sharp as a razor. The year was 1938, and his empire in Harlem was stronger than ever. Yet there was an unsettling stillness in the air tonight. Bumpy was no stranger to danger. He had earned his place at the top of Harlem's underworld, but he knew better than anyone that power was a fragile thing. And in the world he navigated, rivals were always lurking, waiting for the moment they could strike. A figure approached from the shadows, a familiar silhouette, moving with purpose. It was Big Jim, Bumpy's most trusted enforcer. As he got closer, the grim expression on his face was enough to tell Bumpy everything he needed to know. "Boss," Jim said, his voice low, "they've made their move." Bumpy didn't flinch. He had been expecting this day, the day when the enemies he'd made in his rise to power would come together, trying to take him down once and for all. But this wasn't just about power. It was personal. "They?" Bumpy asked, his voice calm, but with a dangerous edge. "Dutch Schultz and his crew," Jim replied, his words sharp like a knife. "They've been making their play for weeks now. Word is they've got a plan to move in on your territory, take Harlem from under your feet." Bumpy's expression darkened. "Schultz. I knew he'd come for it eventually. But this city isn't his to take. The streets of Harlem belong to him. It wasn't just about the money, the power, or the heroin trade. It was about respect. And no one could walk in and challenge him without facing the consequences. Bumpy Johnson had never backed down from a fight, and he wasn't going to start now. "Let's see how far they're willing to go," Bumpy muttered, his voice like thunder just before a storm. "It's time to remind them who runs Harlem." Bumpy Johnson was more than just a name in Harlem. He was a legend, a figure of undeniable influence, power, and fear. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy had come to New York with little more than his wits and a burning desire to succeed. By 1938, he had built an empire on the backs of the streets, the shadows, and the deals that kept Harlem running. The power he commanded wasn't simply about money. It was about the respect he had earned through years of surviving the dangerous game of crime in one of the most volatile cities in the world. Harlem wasn't just a place for Bumpy. It was his kingdom. He ruled the streets with an iron fist, and his reputation spread like wildfire throughout the city and beyond. In Harlem, loyalty meant everything. The people who lived and worked in the district didn't just fear Bumpy, they respected him. He had a way of making sure that everyone in his orbit knew their place. Bumpy wasn't just another gangster. He was a protector, a leader, a king. And kings didn't bow down to anyone. But as much as Bumpy had built, he also had enemies. Rival gangs, corrupt officials, and even some within his own ranks sought to challenge his power. And while he had dealt with many threats over the years, this new challenge came from one of the most formidable figures in the criminal world, Dutch Schultz. Schultz, the notorious New York mobster, had made his name in the bootlegging trade, but his ambitions had grown over the years. Harlem was a prize that Schultz had been eyeing for some time. He saw it as a city of untapped potential, a place where he could expand his empire and claim more power. But he had underestimated Bumpy. Bumpy had been through countless battles, both on the streets and behind closed doors. He had learned to play the game at the highest level, navigating the complex web of power, alliances, and betrayals that defined the criminal world. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a strategist, and he knew that if Schultz wanted to take Harlem, he would have to pay the price. But Bumpy wasn't about to wait for Schultz to make his move. He knew that in this world you didn't sit back and let things happen. You made them happen. And that's exactly what he was about to do. The tension between Bumpy and Schultz had been brewing for months. It started with whispers on the streets, small deals made behind Bumpy's back, and the subtle moves of men who once worked under him, now slipping into Schultz's camp. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, and Dutch Schultz wanted Harlem. Bumpy had heard the rumors, but he didn't act on them immediately. He knew that there was no rush. Harlem was his, and anyone who wanted it would have to come through him. But as the days went by, he began to notice a shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere. People who once gave him the utmost respect were now more cautious, more reserved. It wasn't just the usual street talk, something was happening beneath the surface. It was a cold, rainy night when Bumpy's suspicions were confirmed. Big Jim had caught wind of a secret meeting between Schultz's men and a few of Bumpy's former allies, men who had once pledged their loyalty to him. They were making a deal that would pave the way for Schultz's takeover of Harlem, but Bumpy wasn't about to let it happen. "Jim, we move tonight," Bumpy said, his voice cold and calculating. "It's time to send a message." They gathered their men, the ones who had stood by Bumpy through thick and thin. The message was clear. Loyalty had a price, and if anyone wanted to challenge him, they'd have to deal with the consequences. The target was a meeting place on the outskirts of Harlem, a warehouse where Schultz's men had been gathering. Bumpy's crew moved quietly through the rain-soaked streets, shadows blending with the night. The time for subtlety was over. It was time for Bumpy to make his presence known, to remind Schultz that Harlem wasn't up for grabs. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the gray skyline. It was quiet, almost eerily so, as the rain fell in sheets, washing the streets of Harlem clean, but offering no respite from the tension that had settled in the air. Every step Bumpy took felt calculated, every breath a reminder of the stakes. He wasn't just walking into a fight, he was about to make a statement. His men flanked him, silent as shadows. Big Jim, the muscle, was close by, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. There was no need for words. Every man knew their role, knew what was at risk. Harlem was on the line, and this confrontation would determine who controlled the streets. As they reached the warehouse, Bumpy held up a hand, signaling his crew to stop. The rain pounded harder now, but Bumpy didn't flinch. His mind was focused, his eyes sharp. Inside that building, Schultz's men were making plans. Tonight, Bumpy was going to rewrite those plans. "Stay close," Bumpy muttered, his voice low but commanding. "No mistakes." They moved in closer, using the darkness as their ally. The entrance was guarded, but Bumpy's crew was too quiet, too well prepared. They incapacitated the guards quickly and silently, slipping inside without so much as a sound. Bumpy led the way, his every movement deliberate, every step taken with the precision of a man who knew the game better than anyone. Inside, the men gathered around a table, maps and documents spread out in front of them. The atmosphere was tense. Schultz's crew had been planning something big, something that would shift the balance of power in Harlem. But Bumpy was there to make sure their plans ended before they could even begin. Bumpy stepped into the dimly lit room, his figure cutting through the shadows like a specter. The men around the table froze, eyes wide with surprise. They had expected trouble, but they hadn't expected this. "Well, well," Bumpy said, his voice carrying through the silence. "Looks like I wasn't the only one planning a takeover tonight." His eyes locked on the men around the table, a mix of fear and defiance in their gazes. But it was Dutch Schultz who caught his attention first. Schultz, always the confident one, stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Bumpy. The tension between the two men was palpable. "You're too late, Bumpy," Schultz sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Harlem's mine now. There's nothing you can do about it." Bumpy's response was immediate, his voice cold and steady. "You're mistaken, Schultz. Harlem doesn't belong to you and it never will. You thought you could come in here and take what I've built, but I've got news for you. It's not up for grabs." The men around the table shifted uneasily, unsure of how to react. Bumpy had made his presence known, but it wasn't just about intimidation. It was about control. And Bumpy had it. Schultz, however, wasn't one to back down easily. His bravado kicked in, his hand reaching for his gun beneath the table. "I'm not leaving without what I came for," he growled, his voice tense with anger. Bumpy's eyes flicked to his men, a silent signal. They moved into position, surrounding Schultz's crew with military precision. Bumpy's gun was out now, and it gleamed in the low light as he leveled it at Schultz. "You don't get it, do you?" Bumpy said, his voice icy. "You don't walk into my world and think you can take it from me. You've crossed a line that you can't come back from. This ends tonight." In that moment, the room was charged with the energy of inevitability. Bumpy's crew had the upper hand, but Schultz wasn't done. He moved faster than anyone expected, pulling his gun and firing a shot at Bumpy. But Bumpy was ready. With the precision of a seasoned street soldier, he ducked and fired back in the same motion. The shot hit Schultz's shoulder, knocking him back with a grunt of pain. The room erupted into chaos. Bumpy's men moved quickly, taking out Schultz's men with swift efficiency. There were no heroics, no unnecessary violence, just the cold, calculated actions of men who knew what needed to be done. Schultz, bleeding and gasping, tried to scramble for cover, but it was too late. Bumpy was on him, his presence an undeniable force that could not be stopped. He grabbed Schultz by the collar, pulling him up to meet his gaze. "You tried to take what's mine," Bumpy said, his voice low and steady. "But now you're going to pay for it." Schultz's face twisted in pain and fury as he attempted to speak, but Bumpy cut him off. "You're done here, and so is your crew. Get out of Harlem and don't come back." The finality in Bumpy's voice left no room for argument. The message was clear. This was Bumpy's territory, and anyone who dared to challenge him would be met with swift retribution. As Bumpy walked out of the warehouse, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the streets of Harlem. His men followed closely behind, their expressions resolute, knowing that they had just witnessed another chapter in the legend of Bumpy Johnson. The fallout from that night was swift. Dutch Schultz and his men were driven out of Harlem, their influence shattered in the wake of Bumpy's decisive action. Word spread quickly through the criminal world, but it wasn't just the fear of Bumpy's violence that resonated. It was the respect he commanded. No one doubted his power after that night. Schultz, the once feared mobster who had thought he could walk into Harlem and take over, was left humiliated. His resources dwindled. His connections fell apart, and soon he was nothing more than a footnote in the history of Harlem's underworld. For Bumpy, the battle was over. But the respect he had earned that night would reverberate through the streets for years to come. Harlem was his, and no one, not even the mafia, was going to take it from him. The streets had spoken, and Bumpy Johnson had won the war. The events of that night in 1938 marked a turning point for Bumpy Johnson. The battle for Harlem, once a distant threat from rivals like Dutch Schultz, was now firmly in the past, and Bumpy's position was unshakable. The streets whispered his name with a mix of reverence and awe, and he had become more than just a gangster. He was a symbol of power, an unassailable figure who had not only survived, but had dominated the very forces that sought to undermine him. For those who watched Bumpy's rise from the shadows, the night of the confrontation solidified what many already knew. Harlem was his, and it would remain his for as long as he wanted it. His reputation as the man who could take down even the most powerful adversaries had spread far and wide, reaching not only the underworld of New York, but beyond. From the docks to the city's back rooms, Bumpy's name was synonymous with respect, control, and unwavering authority. The immediate aftermath of the battle with Schultz saw the dissolution of the gang's operations in Harlem. Their rackets crumbled, and the men who had once worked with Schultz found themselves either retreating to other cities or fading into obscurity. Bumpy had made sure that the message was loud and clear. If you wanted to challenge him, you had to be prepared to face the consequences. The community, for the most part, was relieved. Harlem had always been a place of contrast, where the vibrancy of its culture clashed with the dangers of the criminal underworld. But with Bumpy at the helm, there was a sense of stability. The people knew that, for all his power, Bumpy had always been there to protect them from the true predators, the ones who sought to exploit Harlem for their own gain. Bumpy's men, the ones who had fought alongside him that night, were more than just his enforcers. They were his family. They respected him not just because of his power, but because of the loyalty he commanded. They had seen him take on the world and win, and they were ready to follow him anywhere. But Bumpy didn't just demand loyalty. He gave it in return. He made sure that his people were taken care of, and that no one in Harlem would ever forget who ruled the streets. As time passed, Bumpy's influence continued to grow. Harlem became a hub for Bumpy's business ventures, and his empire expanded. He had created a network of allies and associates that spanned the criminal world, the political world, and the underworld alike. His reach was vast, and he operated with a sense of calm and control that made him nearly untouchable. The fear that once defined Harlem's streets was replaced with respect. People no longer looked over their shoulders when they saw Bumpy walking down the street. They stood taller. Bumpy had done something few men ever did. He had earned the street's loyalty, and he had forged a legacy that would outlive him. Bumpy Johnson's name would forever be synonymous with power, respect, and the raw essence of survival. Harlem, for all its rough edges and fractured histories, stood as a testament to his unyielding dominance. His legend wasn't built on a single battle, nor was it defined by the violence he dispensed. It was the product of a man who had navigated the criminal underworld with the intellect of a chess master and the fearlessness of a lion. The streets of Harlem, once plagued by constant turmoil, now found a strange form of stability in Bumpy's reign. For those who understood the delicate balance of power, it was clear. Bumpy's control wasn't just through his muscle, it was his ability to maintain order in the chaos. He wasn't the type of man who ruled through sheer fear alone. No, he earned loyalty, and that loyalty became his shield. He made the streets a place where the people knew, despite the dangers that lurked, that there was a certain level of protection under his watch. But like all legends, Bumpy's story was a reminder that power was never absolute. There was always someone waiting in the shadows, someone ready to test the throne. Yet, through it all, Bumpy remained untouchable, not because of a lack of enemies, but because he always understood one thing better than anyone else. Power isn't only about domination, it's about knowing when to act, when to stay silent, and when to strike with the full force of your reputation. Bumpy's confrontation with Dutch Schultz, the takeover, and the subsequent showdown left a lasting mark, not just in the underworld, but in the very heartbeat of Harlem itself. That night cemented Bumpy Johnson's place in history, not merely as a gangster, but as a symbol of how far a man would go to protect his home and his people. In the world Bumpy inhabited, there was no room for weakness, and there was no room for compromise. It was his way, or no way at all. And so the streets of Harlem would forever bear the imprint of Bumpy's legendary status. His name would be spoken with reverence, whether in the shadows of a dark alley or in the offices of those who dared to cross him. Even years after his time, the echoes of Bumpy Johnson's rule would reverberate across New York City, a constant reminder of a man who took everything he wanted and never gave an inch. This wasn't just the story of one man's rise to power. It was the story of a community's unbreakable resolve, a reminder of the cost of loyalty and respect, and a warning to anyone who would think they could take it all from him. Bumpy Johnson proved that even in the darkest corners of the criminal world, respect and power didn't come by chance. They were earned. And that earned respect, forged through blood, sweat, and the price of his own sacrifices, would forever make Bumpy Johnson the most feared man in Harlem.